Welcome to CIPRI's webinar on the new space industry, a challenge for missile non-proliferation and export controls. My name is Nivedita Raju, and I'm a researcher at CIPRI. I'll be the moderator for today's panel. First, I would like to turn to my colleague, Kolya Brockman, to deliver welcoming remarks on behalf of CIPRI.
Thank you, Nivi. On behalf of CIPRI, I would like to welcome our audience and our panelists to today's webinar. My name is Kolya Brockman. I'm the project lead of the two-year project, Quo Vadis MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime at a Crossroads, and a researcher with CIPRI's Dual-Use and Arms Trade Control Program. This webinar is the second topical webinar that we are hosting as part of this project, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our panelists, so I will keep this very short. I would also like to thank the funders of this project, the German Federal Foreign Office and the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, for supporting our work and events on this topic, including this webinar. Our project builds on the long history of work on export controls at CIPRI, and the multilateral export control regimes, including the MTCR, have always been an important part of that. The context in which the MTCR exists today is markedly different compared to its creation in 1987 and its major expansion in the 1990s. That is in terms of technological developments in rocketry, missiles, and other delivery systems capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction, the access to know-how on missiles, the spread of missiles to more and more states, including outside of the MTCR, and as of late, also direct military conflict between MTCR members, as we see with the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. While these daunting challenges loom large, today we will focus on one very specific topic that combines technological and industrial developments that warrant consideration by the MTCR, but also by other missile non-proliferation instruments, and that is the so-called new space industry. I'm not going to go into much more detail on that because I'm very grateful that we've assembled an excellent panel of experts and practitioners joining us here today, and I look very much forward to learning from their insights and perspectives on this important topic. And with that, I will hand over back to my colleague Nivi, and she will introduce you further to the topic and to the panel that we have joining us today. Nivi, back to you.
Thank you, Kolya. As Kolya mentioned, we will be focusing on the space industry today. Space programs and space launch vehicles have always raised concerns because of their similarities with missiles. Space activities, particularly commercial space activities, have risen over the last few decades, changing dynamics in the global industry. New actors, including states and companies, have emerged, and participation in the space industry is slated to only continue expanding. Manufacturing, in particular, is at the center of this rise in activities. This, coupled with the inherently dual-use nature of space technologies, results in increasing development of and access to space launch vehicles and related technologies. This raises questions concerning potential missile proliferation risks and the trends that these may pose. The Missile Technology Control Regime, the MTCR, is the multilateral export control regime through which participating supplier states coordinate their export control policies and share information. In this webinar, we bring together different perspectives on space issues to identify trends in the new space industry, proliferation risks they may pose, the role of export controls in addressing them, and how the space industry, national authorities, and the MTCR can help prevent missile proliferation. Our webinar today invites a distinguished group of experts to address these issues. We are joined by Almudena Ezcarate Ortega. Almudena is the associate researcher in the Space Security and WMD program at UNIDIR. Her research focuses on space security and missiles. And then we have Andrew Horton, senior technical policy advisor to the UK government and head of the UK technical delegation to both the MTCR and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Since 2019, Andrew is also the chair of the technical experts meeting of the MTCR. Andrew will be speaking today in his personal capacity only. And finally, we have Alan Thompson, head of government relations at Skyrora Limited, specializing in international business development, market access, project financing, and trade financing. And now I'd like to invite Almudena to present insights into the new space industry, major trends and related security and missile proliferation risks. Almu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nivi. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Supri, for having me here. I'm so happy to be part of this panel and to be sharing it with my fellow panelists who are present here today. And I really look forward to the discussion during the Q&A session. Before starting, I'd like to say that my comments and opinions that I share with you here today do not necessarily reflect the views of UNIDIR or the UN. Having said that, and moving on to the question, let's talk about the definition of new space. I don't really think there is a one-size-fits-all definition. The concept of new space is generally used to refer to commercial space companies that have emerged in recent years, in the last decade or so. And although each company is, of course, different, they might have their own objectives and interests, like, for example, some focus on small satellites, others focus on mega constellations, others do launch servicing, launch servicing, and others do on-orbit servicing, or even space tourism. So even though they might be very different, they do seem to share a goal, and this is a goal of wanting to make space more accessible. So they tend to be adaptable, they tend to be willing to adopt new technologies, and they tend to favor structures that are similar to those that we know from internet startups, for example. They often have a global outlook. That means that they don't really seek to become contractors of just one state or a specific space agency, like the old school space companies of for example, the 60s when the race to the moon was going on. But rather they market themselves to international customers and even sometimes to private individuals. The term new space is also used to refer to not just these companies themselves, but also to the shift that the commercial space industry has seen in these recent years. From those big traditional companies that I was referring to that usually served as contractors to governments or to a state space agency, to more dynamic companies which market their services to international customers or individual private citizens. So we often hear that nowadays there are more actors in the space domain than ever before. And the new space movement is a big part of that. It has directly influenced this. Not only are many of these new actors new space companies, in fact, I think it's around an 80% of space activities that are carried out by commercial companies, but also these new space companies have also made space more accessible worldwide. And new space companies tend to be known for their ingenuity, their willingness to develop new technologies. And all of these characteristics seem very positive. However, they do raise certain concerns from a security perspective. So we talked about how these new space companies tend to be known for the willingness to develop new technologies. However, new technologies can sometimes imply new dangers. For example, we have active debris removal technologies or on-orbit servicing technologies. That means space objects that can remove space junk or space objects that can approach another satellite to repair it or refuel it. And that seems, that seems like a positive service. However, the characteristics of these satellites have raised concerns among some that they could also be sort of repurposed for a nefarious objective and harm other satellites through the use of these capabilities, these tools that they have, like robotic arms or whatnot. Also, this increased accessibility that I mentioned can mean increased danger of proliferation of technologies that could be weaponized. And I talked about ADR, which is active debris removal, or on-orbit servicing. But I think the example that has worried policymakers the most is the one that Nivi mentioned. And it's the similarity that exists between space launch vehicles and ballistic missiles. This is actually not new. Missile technology has been repurposed to serve as space launch vehicles since the very first experimentations to go into space. I think probably one of the first was the German V2 rocket, which was used as the basis by the Soviet Union to develop the R7, which is the first ICBM, which was modified to launch Sputnik 1. And it also evolved into the US's Saturn V rocket, which would eventually take humankind to the moon. And this link can still be seen today. For example, the US Minotaur family of space launches use stages of the MX Peacekeeper ICBM. But this also has worked the other way around. That means that states could use or develop, ballistic missile technology or ballistic missile components from technology that they have acquired from space launch vehicles, from the programs, the space programs that they have at a national level. And so the emergence of new space companies that can successfully develop and operate space launch vehicles suggests that the technological barriers that used to exist, on the way of building these high performance rocket motors that can also be used for the purposes of ballistic missile launches, are getting lower and lower. And it is likely that, as these new space companies continue to expand and proliferate, the danger of the proliferation of these technologies can also exist. That the danger that they could be taken and repurposed to be used as ballistic missiles grows. And so this is when the export control conversation becomes so important. Even though there are differences between space launch vehicles and ballistic missiles, they do have certain similarities that we have to be aware of, and that rightfully raise concerns among states and among other stakeholders. So it's important to be aware and to be compliant with export control regulations in order to be able to mitigate this threat of proliferation. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Almu, for that very helpful overview. With this foundation in mind, we'd like to invite Andrew now to discuss how NewSpace challenges export controls and, connecting to the concerns that Almu raised, the relevance of these trends for the MTCR. Andrew, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to start by thanking CIPRI and my fellow panelists for the opportunity to speak. And certainly the previous speaker has covered many of the points that I was going to make, so that makes my life a bit easier, as it were. I mean, I really wanted to touch on some of the aspects, less about the technology side, because I think it's fairly well known, as has been pointed out, the similarities between space launch vehicle technology and certainly ballistic missile technology. And I think there's a sort of key point here when it comes to NewSpace, where we're looking particularly at the smaller launcher side, which are probably closer to ballistic missiles in terms of their underlying technology and the capability that they have. So we've mentioned the Saturn V, for example. That's probably not a very good ballistic missile, or certainly not, it's a bit of an overkill in terms of that capability, as it were. But I think what's of greater challenge, certainly to the export control community, is the range of new actors that are involved in this rather than the actual underlying technology. The MTCR over the years has developed quite an extensive list of the key technologies that are used in sort of ballistic missiles and so forth. But I think what's new for the regimes, I have to say regimes here because there's also the Wassenaar arrangement as well, which is a key export control regime, which covers much of the same technology and an additional technology not covered by the MTCR. But what a challenge is the new actors. So we have a range of new actors, both state and non-state, being involved with this, who have access to the technology, who have less sort of experience, who don't quite have the culture of sort of export controls and complying with regulations. So the sort of historic sort of aerospace defense companies that were traditionally involved in the space sectors, they were very much linked to the states, understood the regulatory requirements, particularly around export controls. But now we're having a new set of entrepreneurial actors in this space that don't necessarily appreciate or understand the sensitivities of the technology and the need to control them from an export control perspective. So in addition to this sort of new actors, this different culture of the new actors that sort of making presence, we also have new actors on the government side. So the space regulators, the sort of people that are there to promote sort of investment and development in this. Again, they're doing their job, but they don't necessarily have a fuller understanding of the sensitivities of the technology and the requirement around protecting those technologies. In addition, there's a sort of new ecosystem in terms of the market and how the sort of companies are looking to promote their services at a sort of global level. So again, there are sort of new challenges that we haven't seen before traditionally with the more state-focused space agency type of activities in this area. So again, as I say, it's an interesting new set of actors being involved. I think from a sort of export control perspective, and certainly within the sort of MTCR and the regimes, there's a need to understand both the actors and the ecosystem that's out there, and potentially a move away from focusing so much on the traditional export controls in terms of controlling those sort of items, that technology, and more towards how we can build a better sort of confidence in the emerging space sector. So looking more towards the sort of transparency and confidence building measures as to provide in the Hague Code of Conduct, for example. So it's a sort of move away from that sort of traditional export controls as being the sort of sole reliance mechanism for controlling the proliferation of technology, but moving towards something that's a little bit more sort of collegiate in terms of the transparency and confidence. But because at the end of the day, every state has, through the various UN mechanisms, they have space treaty and so forth, the sort of right to access space. And the question is, how do you achieve that without letting the genie out of the bottle in terms of the sort of full-blown proliferation of ballistic missile technologies? And I think with that, I will sort of finish fairly quickly and give more time for questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Definitely a lot of points that you've touched upon there as well. And maybe we'll get back to that in the discussion, since you've also mentioned possible solutions. But with the challenges that you've highlighted in mind, I'd like to move to Alan, who will discuss perspectives from the new space industry itself. Please go ahead, Alan.
Thank you very much, and indeed thank you very much to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute for the invitation to take part in this discussion. I think from listening to Almudena and Andrew, I've got a lot to live up to. And yes, I'm from the new space community. Some people call us startups. I think we're an upstart. We are the irritation factor into all of these discussions. We're the guys who want to try and push things to a practical level so that they can work. And I apologize that I'm wearing a suit and tie today rather than my usual NewSpace uniform. But anyway, I represent a launch vehicle manufacturer. We're based in Scotland. And the reason for this discussion is partly because from our point of view, we were founded in 2017, and we only really relatively lately came towards this concept of regulation, very much thanks to the Export Controls Joint Unit in the United Kingdom, who've helped educate us very much around this topic. I think the landscape that we found when we were created as a company was that, as Andrew described just now, that the fact that space has very much been a prerogative, government prerogative, and the actors in space have either have started by being governments and then moved into, I suppose you could say, quasi-governmental organizations or very large conglomerates who are very close to the government, who the government has had confidence in to be able to recreate the requirements and the provisions contained within the missile technology control regime. The challenge that we have as a new space startup, first of all, as I said, is there's been a very, let's say, you could say a white spot. There's not, I would feel, particularly in the United Kingdom, this area has not been over-regulated. And indeed, I think a lot of the reaction to our activity when we started was, oh, really? You're a launch vehicle manufacturer. Are you really serious? And so 6 months of the starting, we need to try to demonstrate that we're serious. And that's been a very kind of like emphasis on the company. I represent Skyrora. We've been trying to make ourselves relevant. And indeed, my role has been to broadly external engagement and external affairs. And yes, a lot of that has been more towards the regulatory environment, trying to understand what rules do exist in this area, how they're applicable, and how can we, if there are not any rules, how can we engage with the relevant regulators to try and create those rules to represent best practice. So there's an awful lot of time from my side trying to make sure that verification of our role within the industry and then bring the industry into these discussions. Why is that important? Obviously, because I don't want this to be subjective. I want this to be as objective as possible. And yes, NewSpace, I suppose part of the DNA of Skyrora, the company we represent, is actually we want to try and go further and be, by launching into space and allowing the United Kingdom to get into regular launch, we want to drive the ambition to do it better. And by doing it better, that means addressing ourselves to our end users, the people in the street, the population, and for us in the first instance to explain to them why we're doing it in a more responsible way. Why are we doing this? And some of the, you could say, the natural regulation from the population in the first instance is around the environment, and then we get to some of the norms and the provisions that we're talking about today within the missile technology control regime. So I suppose with the aspiration that we have ultimately is for us to be understood and engaged with the public, we need to then demonstrate what level of responsibility and how we manifest that responsibility. Responsibility means that we are being measured by the public in our behaviors. So these things are very important for us. But as I said, the kind of regulatory regime in which we were founded was very loose, very under-regulated, and very much, I think, particularly from the United Kingdom's experience, the government really didn't know when it said, oh, we want to do launch and we want to do space. They invested into the equivalent of a parking lot for the roads for the automobile industry. They invested into a spaceport. They haven't significantly invested into a launch vehicle manufacturer, at least from the UK Space Agency side. There are two launch vehicle manufacturers operating and assembling in Scotland. But again, the challenge that we've encountered is that, again, the kind of blur of the boundaries between commercial, military, and government, and where does this all fit? And I would sort of like recreate at this stage that I do kind of feel that we've fallen through the gaps in that regard. And part of this discussion represents an aspiration on our side to try to rectify that falling through the gaps and try to make sure that for companies coming after us, it becomes more clear and apparent. I would also say from the point of view of trying to make sure that the industry is aware of this, I'm very delighted to see that some colleagues have joined from the space industry in the United Kingdom today, particularly from the aspects of, as Alumenda mentioned, the return from space. And how does that happen? What happens if we're developing a technology that allows us to recover satellites? And actually that satellite isn't just a satellite, it's a nuclear device that could actually be deployed in a different way. How is that regulated? Obviously, we know that regulation in outer space doesn't exist, and a lot of this is all camped in the international discussions around space traffic management that are occurring right now, because we believe that things are getting overpopulated up there, and there's a demand or a need for the management of space debris. But some of the challenges that I think that the MTCR, in terms of reviewing the relevance to companies such as ourselves, I think there's a great opportunity. I think one of the huge other things that I think is perhaps somewhat overlooked is that MTCR, as far as I'm concerned, is very much focused on the physical control of items and elements, rather than perhaps the control of data around this. I know it does affect data, but I think the other elephant in the room is the element of cybersecurity and the transfer of data, and how does this work in this context? And indeed, when I first started talking with colleagues with Collier on this topic, the challenge backwards is it's not so much about the physical controls, because usually by the time you get to a physical control, it's already too late. So the challenges I think that the NewSpace represents, the NewSpace dynamic represents to particularly the missile technology control regime is from NewSpace point of view, we really want to engage. We want to demonstrate that we are responsible, not just on the technical side of things, not just with the missile technology control regime, but also with the other aspirations which go above that, we believe, together with peace and environmental challenges that we're being faced with to the population. And I think that's an aspiration that I hope I am voicing on behalf of the space industry. I do think that we want to do this responsibly, and this is the reason why we're desperately keen to be involved in these discussions. I think at the same time, there is this concept that MTCR and supranational regulatory bodies such as the Hague Convention that Andrew also mentioned, there's a huge gap between, or distance between us, between what we're doing on an operational level and actually what is enshrined within the texts and the agreements that have been made already. So there is these kind of challenges. We're desperately keen to help create that framework, and as I said, that's very much part of the aspiration and the reason why we're delighted to take part in today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for those excellent insights. Actually, going back to Almudena and to Andrew for any immediate responses before we move to the discussion. No? Oh, Andrew, I think Andrew has raised his hand. Please go ahead.
Yes, and thank Alan for sort of presenting the industry view. I think Alan has sort of touched on what he mentions about the sort of focus on the physical items, and traditionally export control regimes have always been sort of very focused on those physical widgets and bits of kit and components, and has less sort of focused on the technology. And I think what of particular concern is the transfer of technology and how it can now be done intangibly through the sort of pressing the sort of return button on your laptop and that file shoots off. And that's often the sort of challenge that we have within the export control regimes, as well as the transfer of that sort of intangible knowledge that is often required for complex sort of development of systems such as space launch vehicles and ballistic missiles, where a lot of it isn't something you can write down, has to be actually done and sort of practically experienced to be sort of effective. So just some comments from there.
Thank you, Andrew. Certainly with this operational and more practical perspective in mind, I'm sure that there'll be more questions also moving forward. So this is now, we're moving into the Q&A segment of the webinar. I see that the audience has been using the chat function. Please continue to do so. You can direct questions to individual speakers or the panel as a whole, and of course, all our speakers are welcome to respond. Going back and picking up from the presentations, a question for Almudena first. NewSpace seems to have become more of a topic in, it has been more of a topic in the traditional space security community. So how do these discussions differ from the emerging discussion on NewSpace in non-proliferation and in the export control field?
Thank you, Nivi. And I think in a way, both Andrew and Alan have touched on it when they mentioned how in export control, we deal more with items. And in I think it was Andrew that mentions that it would maybe be positive if the export control discussion would focus a bit more on building confidence, on you know, sort of diminishing tensions, that sort of thing. And I think that has actually been a huge part of the focus of the space security discussion more generally, the building transparency and encouraging measures to build confidence. I think that traditionally the commercial space sector has not been too engaged with the space security community, and they wanted to remain removed from it due to wanting to also be removed from the idea of contributing potentially to a conflict in space, that sort of thing. However, I think that in recent times, they've started to realize that this space security is an issue that affects everyone. And it affects them a lot, obviously, because as I mentioned before, 80% of space activities are carried out by commercial actors. So it's really a discussion that involves everyone. And they've been increasingly vocal about the need to keep space as a secure environment. I think that in the export control field, at least my impression is that the commercial industry has been a lot more active. Perhaps it's less due to concerns about non-proliferation per se, although I'm sure that they do care about this as well, but also due to how export control regulations can affect and can impact their businesses. So export control regimes that are too complicated or too restrictive risk becoming a key competitive barrier to the development of our state's space industry. They can isolate that country by preventing it from engaging in commercial trade. So I think that's one of the reasons why the commercial industry has had an interest in knowing about these regulations and complying with them. And I think it was Alan that mentioned that when you get into the field of commercial space activities, export control is one of the first things that pops up, that it's something that you have to know very well and that you have to take a lot of care with complying with that. As I mentioned, I do agree that a key difference is that export control focuses a lot on items, also the know-how, but specifically physical items. And in space security more generally, the conversation has traditionally been about capabilities, but recently there's been an increased desire to talk about behaviors as well. And I think this clashes a bit with the export control discussion because it's really difficult to verify and monitor behaviors. You can buy or sell a specific item, but how do you know for sure that this item is going to be used for a peaceful purpose? And this goes back to the point that Andrew made. That's why it's so important to focus on transparency and confidence building measures. And this is something that both the export control discussion and the space security discussion could improve upon. And I don't remember who it was that mentioned it, but I think the Hague Code of Conduct is a useful tool in this sense because it encourages these sorts of measures of transparency. I don't know if we have time for more. There's a lot to say about this topic, but I think I might leave it there and we can continue this discussion further in the Q&A.
Thank you, Almo. And I think that you really highlighted that a bit of a tension there tensions between space security discussions and export control in that regard. And a follow-up question for Andrew on this note. So in the UK in particular, how has the NewSpace topic emerged in the export control context, and how has dialogue with other parts of government and industry evolved? Could you maybe share some insight into the UK experience from the government perspective?
Certainly, yes. I mean, again, this is sort of my perspective on it rather than official Her Majesty's government perspective on it. But I think in the UK, we've been certainly at the forefront of the new space changes, particularly in respect to small satellites rather than space launch vehicles. So we've had a number of companies in the UK that have been sort of developing this over sort of decades now, but sort of really working on the satellite side, and they have engaged very actively with the export control authorities. But what we have seen is, again, coming back to this change in the actors coming with the sort of move towards space launch and particularly sort of Anne's touched on the sort of our UK Space Agency colleagues and others that have been involved in this. They're relatively new government agency, and it was interesting that a lot of their sort of initial exposure to export controls came from industry itself. So we were sort of quite sort of pleased that industry was talking about export controls even before we sort of really engage with the space sort of authorities. Since the sort of UK has been working on developing its space launch capability, the sort of spaceports and so forth, export controls have been a key element to that, in that we are very conscious of the risks around the proliferation of the technology, and particularly that the UK's space launch aspirations are again towards the small and micro launchers rather than the larger systems used for sort of place and communication satellites in geostationary orbit and so forth. So we have been very conscious of that in terms of the specific technologies that need to be controlled. In addition, we have for a number of years been talking to partners around the concerns around the capabilities. So certainly with satellites, for example, Earth observation satellites are a key sort of element within the sort of use of strategic systems, certainly in terms of providing targeting information, targeting data for ballistic missiles, providing the navigation and guidance for cruise missiles. So it's not simply about the missile technology being transferred, it's about the transfer of strategic capabilities through access to commercial space itself. So again, that's been a sort of key area that we've been very engaged with the sector in and international partners on that. I just wanted to very quickly also touch on what other panelists have said about the sort of transparency and how potentially to do. Within the MTCR, there is a provision about not sort of impacting adversely national space programs, provided those programs aren't or isn't a risk of being used for WMD delivery system. I think one of the challenges that we have is how do we sort of understand and have the sort of confidence that that risk isn't happening. And again, this is something that we've looked at in the UK to ensure that any UK activity doesn't have the potential to be used for the development or eventual production of ballistic missile systems or to support the use of cruise missiles. So again, I think this is an important thing that we as a regulator, not just in the UK, but across the board, needs to ensure that we are able to ensure that companies and sort of organizations within our sort of territories and under our authorities aren't engaged in those activities as well. So it's not just about the technology, it's also about ensuring that those that we sort of have responsibility for and authority over are equally aware of the issues and are subject to the sort of provisions that we can impose on them. And with that, I will stop there.
Thank you, Andrew. I actually wanted to maybe start with Gerben's question from the audience Q&A regarding the participation of non-state actors in these multilateral discussions. He's referred to the open-ended working group on space threats and how all of these new space actors could participate. Maybe Alan, from the industry perspective, are there suggestions or are there recommendations on ways in which this could happen from the industry side before moving to the other panelists?
So I think the simple answer is yes, and sort of tied into Andrew's and Lumina's comments just now, I would suggest that the NewSpace community is unfettered by this element of security and need to cut off or need to limit an understanding of our activity. So part of obviously what we're doing as a launch vehicle manufacturing is we are creating a ballistic missile, or effectively an equivalent. The suborbital launch vehicle that we have is a 3-ton engine that can carry 100 kilograms of payload to approximately 126 kilometers. Of course, it has dual use. The challenge that we have is that because we started doing this within a commercial context, and as I mentioned, this kind of slightly loose framework, again, back to Andrew's comments about the government. So the perception from the industry is that when the UK space agencies began to commit to launch, I think the element of space puts everything into focus. There is nothing out of focus, and it puts a huge emphasis on communications and collaboration and the ability to communicate transparently, adequately, and timely with the required stakeholders to be able to make sure that the messages are there, that there is this awareness and engagement. And the space agency, when it started its commitment to launch, it wasn't sure or certain about whether space needed to be designated as an element of critical national infrastructure for the United Kingdom. There's that is still reflected in today in where we are with the space agency, although we've moved forward significantly. From the point of view of, again, of a company that's creating these things for the first time, yes, we're calling them launch vehicles for satellites. And yes, as I said, I mentioned already, we are engaging with the public, which is, again, our you could say, our ultimate regulator, and we want to demonstrate that responsibility. But nevertheless, you know, we are creating these things. There aren't any other companies who are creating these things in the UK who have the same level of public engagement that we do. Nevertheless, there is this absence of designation of critical national infrastructure, which would help or which would facilitate this kind of proximity to all of the regulators that we require. And part of the challenge, as I said, is bringing this, is for companies such as ourselves, trying to bring these arguments back to particularly these kind of discussions and say, well, these apply to our big brothers who make these missiles or these ballistic missiles in a governmental context, but they're not taking part in these discussions because they're part of that security element or this kind of like covert discussion that exists at a completely different level. I think that the opportunity that this NewSpace dynamic represents is actually helping get more tangibility for these companies and indeed the defense community to the public about what is actually happening. And I think the further we exploit space, the more we will see the convergence of this, as Andrew mentioned already, the kind of like the blurring of the lines between the commercial activity and where the security aspect needs to be in focus. As I think also Alumena also mentioned that I think there's a very interesting fact from the US as well, where there is more ubiquitous.
Oh, sorry, Alan. I think you were on mute. I think you just went on mute.
I don't know what happened there. There's more data about space situational awareness available in the commercial context than there is in government context nowadays. So commercial new space is actually having a much bigger effect and demand or requirement to be able to drive that tangibility and to be able to, as I said, represent to our responsible or what we hope to be responsible behaviors to work on that overlap and to make it more tangible. And I think that's the opportunity out of particularly this kind of discussion. I would say that actually it's great. It's a great I think a tribute to the relationship that we've developed with the UK regulators to be able to get them to get to that proximity of their awareness of our activities to the level of detail that we have achieved so far, so that we do have that transparency. But I think there's an awful lot more to be said for, again, bringing the defence community into this discussion more wholesale and trying to allow them to talk where they can talk without the breach of any kind of secret information, but actually help them, in the generic terms, to be much more a wholesome partner in these kind of discussions.
Thank you, Alan. Going to Almu for any responses as well to that.
Yes, thank you, Nivi. I love that question. I'm heavily involved with the open-ended working group, so I really want to encourage everybody in the commercial space industry to become involved with this initiative and this process as well. I think the space domain, space activities nowadays reflect a really diverse world in terms of geographical diversity, but also stakeholder diversity. And the recommendations that come out of that group have to reflect this diversity in order to be truly effective. And the commercial space industry is a huge part of this. They have a vested interest in keeping space a secure domain. So they should be involved in these discussions. Despite the fact that this is obviously a state-led process, the commercial industry has a lot to bring to the table. They have a lot of know-how that states might sometimes lack. So their perspectives are unique and so valuable. So I think that the fact that this is an open-ended working group, keyword open, is great, and the commercial space industry should definitely take this opportunity to participate and to become involved.
Thank you, Almu. And maybe actually bringing in one of the questions from Peter from the chat for all of our panelists: how global is NewSpace outside of the West, and about conducting outreach to these non-traditional space actors? Is there any one of our speakers who'd like to take this question first? Andrew, go ahead.
Okay, I think it's a very good question, because traditionally anything related to space has always been viewed as sort of the superpowers that sort of get actively involved, and the sort of slightly less superpowers also sort of involved. What's missing, I think, from a lot of the discussion are those smaller nations that aren't they don't think this is an area that they need to be involved, because they don't necessarily have a space program, for example, but they do at the end of the day rely on the services and capabilities that space offers to the planet. So if you've got countries that use global navigation and benefit from that, who use geostationary based telecommunications, so we're all use and benefit from space, and there hasn't been, I don't think, that level of engagement with those smaller nations, which to some extent rely critically on the space infrastructure. So I would welcome, from my perspective, the engagement with or more holistic engagement from those smaller countries in this matter.
I think if I can add on the global aspect, if that's okay.
Yes,
we as a small company are focused on trying to be as responsive as possible, which means being able to support the satellites in orbit, so the internet satellites that are being deployed at the moment, so that effectively there is a continuous service for internet to the places that are already being achieved, whether that be through Starlink or through OneWeb or the other internet service providers. So the idea from our point of view and the way we're positioning ourselves is to be a support service to these companies, to be able to deploy satellites quickly, to be able to support them in orbit, and to be able to maneuver them from one orbit to another to give better coverage, or to be able to replace them and then remove them at the end of life. And this is, again, the responsiveness in that respect, the ability to be able to deploy a couple of new satellites is a critical aspect, because, again, you'll have your consumers, your end users at the end waiting for their internet coverage to be restored, and they're paying for it. So ultimately, there is a cost aspect to be able to be responsive, and that drives also the ability to launch from where. Again, if you're launching as we are, or our aspirations to launch are limited to the northern hemisphere and firing over the polar ice caps, where again most of our users that we're targeting are likely to be Earth observation satellites, which are going the polar orbits or the sun synchronous orbits, going around the Earth, providing as much coverage of the surface as possible in as efficient way as possible. Because we're firing from the Northern Hemisphere, we are looking at spaceports and collaborations across the Northern Hemisphere, from Canada, including Iceland, who is a NewSpace actor, and with whom we've spent a lot of time trying to encourage to understand some of the elements of how to regulate and how to come up with a permit for this launch activity, but also putting that into the context of organizations such as the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and indeed back into the context of the Hague Convention and some of the other elements that we talked about today, including as well going all the way back down to the MTCR regime when we physically took our suborbital launch vehicle from the United Kingdom to Iceland. So there's a whole range of these aspects that by being responsive and by being global, we come across and we have begun to learn and try to incorporate in our approach. As I said, I think some of the challenges, I mean, you could say from the 70s onwards in the space industry, the joke or whatever you mentioned, as Alumena kind of mentioned it when we started. So the space industry, a lot of the new space industry is derived from the V2 bomb, whether that was the United Kingdom gifting a V1 bomb back to Stalin, who then reverse engineered it into their historical chain of rockets, or whether that's with von Braun going to the United States and developing it there. The one thing that we've forgotten about in the UK is that we actually did it ourselves as well. But one of the first questions is, where did your engine come from, and whose intellectual property is that? I think, again, this discussion has now evolved to the next level, and indeed a response that I believe the Export Controls Joint Unit in the United Kingdom is also addressed, which is not just the transfer of technology, but also the knowledge in its first and pure form. And how do you enable awareness around knowledge bearers, people who understand how to design these engines and where they're located? So previously it was von Braun and trying to get von Braun out of Germany into the United States. Nowadays, again, we're talking about individuals who have that kind of level of knowledge. And I think that, as I said, the United Kingdom has done a very good job at trying to push awareness in the academic community around some of these challenges and the point of regulation. So I do think that actually, obviously, with the COVID pandemic, we've kind of gone back to sovereign nations to a greater degree. But I still do think that this global aspect of the earth that we're on, and indeed the exploitation of space, we're doing for the benefit of humankind. So I do think that there will be a significant movement of launch vehicle manufacturers such as ourselves. Indeed, Elon Musk, I think, was looking also for other launch state opportunities, although at the moment still the most convenient place for him is still the United States due to the huge amount of infrastructure they already have there. But yes, I think there is an aspiration to go global. As Andrew mentioned, I think there are non-members or non-signatures to the MTCR regime who are considering space, but they don't know how to. So I think a lot of what, again, I think the NewSpace challenge brings into this is actually more education around how to make this happen. And as we're trying to do in a responsible way, trying to do it as transparently as possible.
Thank you, Alan. Moving to Almudena for the same question regarding this outreach with when it comes to new space outside of the West and getting more non-traditional space actors to participate.
Yes, thank you. I think this is no longer a hypothetical. I think this is already something that we are seeing happening. For example, the Latin America region has an increasing interest in space and space activities. I think Africa is also a really good example of this. India is probably a really good example of this as well. So we are already seeing that the global South is becoming increasingly invested and interested in being active participants in space. When we talk about being active in space, we tend to imagine being launch capable or having satellites in space, but that doesn't necessarily always have to be the case. I think it was Andrew that really rightly said that at the end of the day, we are all really dependent on space technology. Even if you are not a spacefaring state, you profit from the services that space provides. So I think this is something that is already a reality, and it's something that we're already seeing reflected as well, not just at the state level, but also at the commercial level. I also wanted to if you allow me to take a step back and go back to the point of how these new actors, especially the commercial industry, can engage in these processes such as the OEWG. That there is actually interest from the state's perspective to encourage the engagement of commercial actors, to engage directly with them, because as you might know, under the outer space treaties, states are responsible for the activities of their nationals. This includes non-governmental entities such as the commercial space industry. So it is in a state's best interest to ensure that the commercial space industry is knowledgeable of the regulations, and so that they comply with them, so that the state itself is not responsible at the international level if something goes wrong. I would encourage commercial industry to seek the states out, to want to engage with them, and also engage with organizations such as civil society. I think civil society is a great tool and can be a really good nexus to connect government with the commercial industry, and also multinational, international entities. That there is obviously the UN as a whole, but UN entities such as the one I represent, UNIDIR as well. We do make a lot of efforts to provide that nexus. So there are lots of opportunities. I know that when it comes to engaging in the multilateral process, it seems a bit daunting. I can completely understand that. But there are a lot of options, and I really encourage the commercial industry to seek those out.
Thank you, Almu. Next, I'm going to try and take on the questions that Dimitri has raised in the chat. So he's asked for all the panelists whether it's actually possible to limit military missions for new space companies, and he's also asked about the possibility of smaller companies suffering in terms of financial capabilities and the vulnerabilities of these companies in terms of malignant foreign actors. So for these questions, maybe I'll turn to Andrew first. Would you like to take a stab at them?
I think the first point about sort of limiting involvement with the military is probably going to be a sort of a challenge, because countries have the legitimate right to self-defense. So it'd be very challenging to sort of say to companies, you can't be involved with military satellite or launch military satellites. I think that the sort of key point is to ensure that they're, certainly for launch companies that are developing their own vehicle capability, that isn't misused in terms of being developed into a ballistic missile system. And I think the challenge for the international community is sort of the basic lack of a treaty or other international legal mechanism around non-proliferation of WMD delivery vehicles. And that's always been a challenge, I think, for those involved like themselves in sort of missile non-proliferation, that there isn't an equivalent to the NPT that we can sort of point to and say, right, we shouldn't be doing that from a sort of legal perspective or a normative perspective on that. I think Dimitri's actually totally right about the financial issues, and this is something that does worry us particularly around the sort of ecosystem, the number of companies that are sort of coming up with ideas for space launch systems, and the question whether the actual satellite market is big enough to support all of those companies with aspirations in this area that do take sort of investment to develop the technology, only to find that there is no sort of real substantive market which enables them to then repay back that sort of funding in the sort of legitimate satellite market. And they look to alternatives such as selling the technology to those countries with sort of proliferation concerns with. So again, this sort of is a challenge, I think, for the non-proliferation community around ensuring that there isn't this sort of selling of this technology when these companies struggle in the market. So I think that hopefully covers the questions of Dimitri.
Thank you, Andrew. Unless anyone else from the panel would like to respond, I'd also like to move to Sean's question. To Sean, asking about who would be the go-to body for NewSpace to learn about export controls and MTCR. From the industry perspective, Alan, maybe you'd like to answer this before we go back to Andrew.
Certainly, thank you. Yes, no, I can point Sean towards, there's a structure in the United Kingdom called Aerospace Defence and Security. It's an association, and it has under its auspices something called the Export Group on aerospace defence and dual use. This is an industry group and collaboration where this group has regular contact with the Export Controls Joint Unit. There are experts within this group who can give advice, such as Andrew is also renowned for supporting and helping with the education angle of things. But unfortunately, Andrew's only one, so we're trying to help spread the good word and the good work that Andrew does throughout the United Kingdom. And this is the industry group that helps enable that. I think there is, again, an awareness or a challenge, particularly that Sean draws attention to in this new space. And it's almost, I wanted to be provocative back to Almudena, saying that there are a huge amount of regulations out there that indeed we don't even know. So we start from a point of ignorance. We don't know where to go to even start understanding if this is regulated or not. Partly because, as I said, a lot of these regulations occurred when the government put them in place for their outsourced, let's say, the service providers, people who made these ballistic missiles all those years ago, and they were by default an extension of the government. So there's a huge amount of written rules out there that when we start as a new company, we really don't know where to go. And I think part of the challenge and part of the opportunity, I suppose, from my side, is also to help create a handbook to help new space companies identify and answer the questions that we've just had from Sean along the lines of, where do we go? Where do we need to have the answer to? And I think part of the challenge is also mapping that regulatory backdrop from the point of view of a new space company. If we want to be global, how do we do it in a way that is being responsible? I suppose you could say, again, default back to my standard position, which is saying that above all of these supranational or these national levels of regulation, we have trillions of individual regulators, which are the population of of the Earth, which I think if we put them that way around, then of course we've got an even more complex picture. But I think there is a challenge of awareness. There's a challenge of, where do we find all this information? How do we know this is going to be applied to us? And what does it mean in the practical application? As I said, a lot of our personal experience in this area has been through, and very much thanks to the EGAD group within the United Kingdom, helping us steer us in the right direction. Sometimes it's also been, and very grateful to Andrew again for his consultation in these areas, where it's been down at the level of, oh, is this country good or is it not? And of course, it usually starts with, is this country a signature to the Missile Technology Control Regime? And there we go from there. But it's an element of not just checking verification, it's informing and staying close to our regulators so that we can actually, I suppose, encourage this new regulatory regime of proximity, so that the regulator sees where we're going, the regulator has a clear understanding, and building that trust. I think that's the best thing, is this element of self-regulation and demonstration for new space companies that we have this aspiration and we want to maintain the transparency, and where best we can capture case studies and represent them back for our other colleagues in industry.
Thank you, Alan. I'm briefly going to go back to Almu in case she wants to respond very quickly.
Yes, very quickly. I agree with Alan. I think governments, especially of spacefaring countries, generally do have a source of infrastructure that can provide this information. But sometimes private organizations, for example, alliances between different commercial actors, also can be really helpful. An organization that comes to mind is the Satellite Industry Association in the US, for example. But there are many others in this sense. But I also do want to raise a bit of a problem. This is easily accessible in countries that are, spacefaring, or even, recently emerging spacefaring countries. But this can be a bit more tricky for countries that are starting out, so they might not have that infrastructure. And in those situations, sometimes you have to go to the source of like regional or multilateral international level, look at how it is done in the countries that have alliances with that specific country where you have your company, and try to look for options that encourage your government to establish those alliances and establish those mechanisms, because that is a problem, that if your state is not very focused on space activities, it might not have that infrastructure and you might have to look for it elsewhere.
Thank you, Almudena. Also, quickly taking a question from Marcus on the negative effects on the industry in this sense, and how to balance that possibly with export controls. Maybe we could start with Andrew this time.
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of put some ideas out there about what Alan said in terms of accessing information, both for companies, but also for government agencies and governments. I think there is a challenge with absolutely, and I think the first port of call is the export licensing authority within the country. But I think there's a challenge around awareness of export control by the regulators within countries, even if they sort of have a regulator as part of the problem, in that a lot of sort of regulatory focus has been on safety of space launch, of space operations, rather than security. And I think there needs to be a sort of awareness and a change in the sort of perspective to look at security as an element of space operations, space launch operations, in addition to safety. And here, I think there's a sort of an important sort of piece of work that needs to be done by international bodies. So, for example, I think the sort of MTCR needs to pick up its game in this area, the Hague Code of Conduct equally, but I would also point to organizations like AKO, the International sort of Civil Aviation Authority regulator, needs to be sort of have that sort of promote awareness. One of the challenges is that we don't have a space launch or space operation equivalent to the International Atomic Energy Agency. So there isn't that single international global body that you can go to for that information on that. So that's on that. And I do apologize, I forgot what the second part of the question you asked was.
The possible negative effects on the industry that Marcus had raised in terms of it being kind of preventing what you would want to see happen. We can move to Alan. Alan, if you'd like to answer that as well.
Sure, I think it's negative depending on your perception. I think again, if you have this level of responsibility that you want to make things happen, and you try to understand the applicability of these rules and how they apply to you and how they fit in within your business plans, whatever else it is, I think I actually would prefer to see the export controls and the MTCR more as an enabler rather than a limiter, because that's exactly what it was there for in the first place. The MTCR was a regime, an agreement between countries that this is how they wanted to regulate this collaboration. Now, again, I think the perception is at the moment that MTCR is actually a limiter. The perception is that ITAR is a limiter. It's not. It's a way that governments have agreed to be able to try to allow things to happen, to enable things. So I think it's only for the nefarious actors that control regimes are a problem and that they aren't taken into account. I think it very much depends on your perception. I do think that, again, from my point of view, I think there is this, a global statement about engagement in industry with regulators. There is this overwhelming desire, because we're going faster, being able to deliver things faster, becoming more responsive in a digital world. There's an overwhelming responsibility on industries such as ourselves to be able to demonstrate that responsibility and the regular engagement with regulators, even though perhaps there's not a piece of regulation in this area. And it's this responsibility which I think is fundamentally important for new space companies. We need to know that although we think that this is under-regulated as an area, we need to know that unless we communicate with the right stakeholder at the right time, we could find ourselves out of that box and misunderstood. And being misunderstood then leads to negative consequences such as whatever it could, compliance or control regimes where you end up on the wrong side of things. And that is the challenge. I think the control regimes need to be tested. Yes, that's I think where you could say the upstart side of NewSpace comes in. Yeah, we want to test them, we want to verify it, and we want to understand why it's an enabler and why within this it's better within this arrangement, this framework of rules, rather than outside it. But I do think at the same time it very much it depends on your perception and your willingness to incorporate these elements into your business plan.
Thank you, Alan. And I see a question from Patrick about coordination in the sense from moving back to the broader question of engagement and about government departments coordinating with each other because it's difficult to know which department has control or oversight in certain cases. So in this regard, if we want to increase our engagement and coordination, even internally within states and between states, what exactly should we start moving towards? What are the immediate steps that we could take in this sense? Who would like to take this first? Andrew?
I just want to say that Pat's absolutely right. This is a challenge, and we identified the challenge within the UK as we developed, particularly the space launch side. We ended up with a number of different government agencies involved, and there is always the sort of lack of awareness of export controls and the broader security issues, because much as, and I've touched on this before, much of the emphasis of those other departments is safety rather than security, which is absolutely sort of as it should be. But as I say, from a export control and security perspective, we need to up our game to be more sort of aware people that this is a key issue going forward, certainly in terms of global partnerships and working more globally.
Thank you, Andrew. And quickly to Almu before we move to, I see we have to wrap up also before we move to closing remarks.
Thank you. No, I completely agree with Andrew, but I do have to say that I did disagree with something that Alan said before on the limitations. Generally, I do agree with him that export control regimes are there to help, and they only limit the bad guys, so to say. But I do think that domestic export control regimes can sometimes be limiting to commercial actors. And I think the US a few years ago was a good example of this, how it was too restrictive at the time, and other states developed this policy, this ITA-free policy, where they refused to engage with the US because it was just too cumbersome to engage with them, and that they would just do business with other countries instead, and this debilitated the US commercial industry. So I think that export control regimes have to be careful not to be too restrictive and not to be too permissive. And I think that's where the multilateral mechanisms like the MTCR or the Wassenaar arrangements can be really helpful, because they can sort of set a sort of international baseline that domestic regimes can take as an example, so that they are more or less uniform, although they are free to adapt as needed. So I just wanted to make that clear. I think this is something that states should take into consideration at the domestic level.
Thank you, Almu. If you'd like to respond, Alan, I mean, we're running out of time, so 30 seconds. I'll be very strict.
Just very quickly, I would say that then business hasn't done its job properly, because as Andrew knows, in the United Kingdom, we have a huge business case. And unfortunately, the export control regime is perceived to be the blocker at the moment, because we don't have any national regulation around data policy. So at the moment, the United Kingdom companies are curtailed from trading data internationally, because it's the huge volume of this is now falling to the Export Controls Joint Unit to individually monitor and allow every single kilobyte of data. We need a policy regime. So industry needs then go back to government and say, we need a data policy to be able to enable the Export Controls Joint Unit to do their job properly. And that's the attitude that needs to come. So if it's industry that is, I don't think that export controls need to be perceived as the blocker. They need to be the enabler. And that's what industry isn't doing its job properly. Sorry, thanks.
Thank you, Alan. And now I think we'll have to wrap up and move to closing remarks. We'll have to be extremely short. So very quickly, going to all of our panelists today, what are your most important priorities for the space sector, for the new space sector from the MTCR context? Based on the discussions today, based on all of the challenges that we raised, what would your key takeaways be? We can start with Andrew.
I think in one word, awareness. There needs to be greater awareness amongst industry and amongst international partners.
Thank you, Andrew. Almu?
I agree. I think awareness is a key takeaway, and to add to that, I would say maybe increased transparency, use export control regimes to encourage transparency among the different stakeholders.
Thanks, Almu. And Alan, finally,
and
last but not least.
Not being a fan of talking shops, but yes, awareness, communication, engagement. I think space will force an awful lot more of optimization and engagement around these topics. And the fact that we've had this discussion today, I think, is exceedingly useful. Again, on the end, awareness and education, I think NewSpace will continue to be that irritant. And please do reach out to us. And I'd love to be able to have, a continued relationship with the UN institutions, and indeed with our close regulator, who I hope is sitting on our shoulder and being very close to us and transparent, because we don't want to be misunderstood. I think that's the fundamental basis when we are chartering new territories, new frameworks that need to be put in place. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists for such an engaging discussion, and to our audience as well for participating. A recording of this webinar will be available on CIPRI's YouTube channel. And in September, we will publish a paper on the topic of today's webinar. So please stay tuned. Please be in touch with Kolya or myself if you'd like to know more, and hopefully we can keep this discussion going. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.